Hi, I'm Dave Kassler, amateur radio call sign KE0OG, and this is one of the Sky Series videos documenting a trip that my flight instructor and I took from Delta Airport, which is KAJZ, Alpha Juliet Zulu, up to the northwest to Mac Mesa Airport, an airport I'd never heard of. It's on the far side of Grand Junction, and it is 10 Charlie Oscar. I think I've got that right. 10 Charlie Oscar is the ID for that particular airport. So in my research, I looked very closely at the aeronautical chart and how we could get there with the least trouble. Some things that are considerations on the way. First of all, Mac Mesa is a tiny airport, as you will see in the video. The runway is only 60 feet wide. The runway is only 2,600 feet long. Okay, the runways are 07 and 25, which is essentially east-west. Okay, considerations. We'll be going by Grand Junction Airport. My original idea was to bypass the Class D airspace, which would have us flying up a narrow strip of land right over the Colorado River. But my flight instructor opted to call them and ask for permission for transit to go across their airspace. It's Class D airspace. They were quite happy to let us do that. I haven't yet received any training on how to deal with control towers and things like that, so that will be coming. That's a separate endorsement, by the way. It's not part of the core sport pilot syllabus. So there were other things that we needed to avoid. There's a Dominguez Canyon wilderness area, and the problem with it, it's got those little dots on the diagram, which means we have to be at least 2,000 feet above it to fly over it, and we weren't going to be that high. It's a shame too, because these are some of the prettiest spots in Colorado, but we had to avoid that. Also had to avoid Colorado National Monument, either avoid or 2,000 feet over it. And the Black Ridge Canyons Wildlife Area, we had to avoid or go 2,000 feet over it. As it was, we went we avoided them, went over the other side. So that allowed us a narrow strip to go north. You know how they say I follow, or IFR means I follow roads, rivers, and railroads. Well, that's what we did. I mean, the landmarks for how to get to Mac are extremely evident until you actually get closer to it, in which case you go cross country and look for a sort of a rectangular shaped reservoir going north and south. We cross the reservoir and then we're on our approach to the airport. I also jotted down the frequencies and so on for Grand Junction in case we had to talk with them, or it would be a good divert airport too. And there is a little interesting FAA rule. It's sort of a first level of traffic separation, and that is if you are going even slightly west, you have to be at an even thousandths altitude plus 500. So that meant we could go 4,500, 6,500, and 8,500. To do 4,500 would be subterranean, so that didn't work. 6,500, by the time we got to Grand Junction, had us about 2,000 feet over the ground level. Or we could have gone 8,500, which would have been overkill, so we picked 6,500. That meant coming back the other way, we had to have an odd number, and so we picked 7,500. Now, if it is traffic that is flying under the control of the IFR, the whole IFR system, then they would take the odd or even thousands, but right at a level altitude. So if you're flying to the west and you're under control, you could take 6,000, 8,000, 10,000, 12,000, and so on. And this separates the IFR traffic from the VFR traffic. And of course, we were very VFR, and we were squawking VFR all the way, which meant squawk 1200. Okay, so we had a great time. Now I'm going to abbreviate the video a little bit because it takes about 45 minutes for all the hoofraw to get up there, and I'll just take highlights of that. As we take off from Delta Airport, the pattern altitude is 6,200, so we went and took off to the northeast, looped around, and as we looped around, we climbed until we were at our 6,500 feet target altitude, and cut off a corner of the West Winds Airport, came in over Whitewater, and then went over Grand Junction. This is the first time I've really seen Grand Junction from the air, and one thing that I'll point out to you is the confluence of the Gunnison and the Colorado rivers. And then we land, and that's where we end this. On the way back, there wasn't enough battery power in the GoPro to capture everything on the way back, but when we landed, we had a direct crosswind, I mean perpendicular to the airport, of something like 17 or 18 gusting to 25, and we did it. The crosswind landing technique that my flight instructor taught me worked just fine, and we made it back in one piece. I particularly enjoyed this particular outing. It was fun. It's nice to be able to just fly, and gives you a chance to look out the window. One thing I have to do since I'm flying manually is maintain that 6,500 feet. Now, what you're going to see on the screen down in the lower left-hand corner is the miles per hour in GPS speed, which is not airspeed, it's ground speed in GPS miles per hour. And then in the center is a pointer showing direction. The pointer is referenced to true north, not magnetic north, true north. Up above it, you'll see a sort of a pattern of that we flew, just a line most of the time. And then in the lower right-hand corner is the altitude, which varies quite a bit. This is GPS altitude, which is notorious for wandering all over the place. We actually kept a fairly constant 6,500 feet on the altimeter going north. On the way back was a little harder because it was so gusty, and gusty means up and down as well as to the side. And in the data that is on the right, in the middle there, the important one is the altitude. So you can see where we are altitude-wise, actually read it out. Again, GPS altitude. And the clock time is way off. I don't know why, because I've got the thing set up so that every time it connects to the PC, it resets the date and time. And then it's hours off. We actually left about 10:30, something like that. Anyway, it was definitely more in the morning, not 4 in the afternoon. And so I hope you enjoyed this. Sorry for the longer intro, but I wanted to tell you about all the kinds of planning that had to go into this. You can't fly over federal recreational lands, things like national monuments and so on, unless you're at least 2,000 feet above them. So I just wanted to avoid that hassle of staying away from them over there. So let's take a look. We're going to start out by taking off from Delta. I'm going to skip a lot of the desert, okay, but I'm going to let us look at Grand Junction and skip a little bit as we go from there, and then set it up as we start setting it up for landing. Coming in at 6,500 feet, we're way too high for pattern altitude for the Mac Airport. The Mac Airport is 4,700 feet, so we had to get down to 5,700 feet. And I basically just cut the power back and slowly slope down to that rather than try any altitude losing maneuvers or anything like that. Okay. Okay, here we go. We're taking off from Delta Blake Airport, runway 3, which actually heads the wrong way. So we're going to take this airport down here, lift off, fly along the runway till we get down to the end and then turn around as though we were going on crosswind and downwind, and then take off from the downwind over toward the west. And it does not take much room for the aircraft to become airborne. Now we're going to skip a little bit here. We've turned around now, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner where the GPS track is. This is Delta, Colorado. Delta marks the confluence of the Uncompahgre and Gunnison rivers. And those basins that you're looking at down there filled with water are filled by the Gunnison. But just off at the end of town, the two rivers join to each other. Now, as I mentioned, we had to stay to the east of Highway 50. That's US Highway 50 down there. Here we go over to the desert. It's basically desert between Delta and Grand Junction. In fact, if you look square in the middle of the frame, just under the far mountains, you see kind of a belt of green, a very thin belt of green. That is Grand Junction. If you look just below that, there's another little brown belt, and then a little short strip of green. That is Whitewater. What I did not know until I took this flight was that Whitewater is where the Gunnison River comes out of the Escalante Canyon area and back out to where it's going to flow over into the Colorado River. This is Whitewater right here, and that river that you see there, there's some dikes and stuff, but the river kind of goes to the right of them and then back. That's the Gunnison. It comes very close to the highway there. And the railroad track follows the river, and so the railroad track is there too. And just over this little hill, we're going to encounter Grand Junction. Now what we see here is this turn from the highway down here at the bottom that goes only to the right is the direction you would go if you were going to Denver. That cuts off going through Grand Mesa. This road ahead of us, as you can see from the GPS track, goes up at about a 45-degree angle to the northwest. The speed that we're trying to maintain is between 95 and 100 miles an hour during cruise. If you'll note over there, the altitude, 6,517 feet. We're trying to maintain 6,500 feet on our altimeter. The GPS height is not the best because we don't have one of the expensive processors that can do that. But we're doing pretty good maintaining 6,500 feet. One of the problems we're going to get into as we come through here is that we will be entering the Class D, Class Delta airspace for Gunnison Airport. Gunnison Airport is right over there underneath where it says 6518 altitude. That little clump of buildings is the airport. It is Class D. We could have gone over the river and avoided this, but my flight instructor had no problem contacting them and saying we wanted to transit their airspace. And they were perfectly happy to give us permission to do so. So we're going up through Grand Junction. Now you see the Gunnison River over on the left, and on the right, if you look kind of in the middle of the picture, you can see the Colorado River. The two are going to join here shortly. There's new housing right underneath us here. If you look in the middle, you see kind of a white industrial area. There's fairly large rail yard at Grand Junction. In fact, that's where the term comes from. It's the Grand Valley, and this was the junction of the railroad with the railroad that went south to Montrose and also up over to the coal mines up out of Paonia. And there's an industrial area there, and then we'll get up over a shopping area. Now we're about to fly over the Colorado River. We'll try not to miss it because we can see the actual confluence of the two rivers. The rivers are two different colors, okay, and you'll actually see the water flow side by side for a quarter mile or so before they really start to mix. So you can see over on the left-hand side, kind of behind that little blue arc that I wish were in a different spot, but you can see the water getting about ready to come into the Colorado. This is all industrial below us. This is the big city in western Colorado. And right here, right there, right under the 100 mark, right there, you can see the Gunnison River come in and meet the Colorado River. And for about a quarter mile, they flow side by side. Now you can tell by the relative size that there's far more water in the Colorado than there is in the Gunnison. Now, what happens here is we're going up over downtown. This is old downtown, Grand Junction. And the railroad, the highway are coming up here. There's big malls here. There's a lot of big box stores. They've got Cabela's and Red Lobster and what's that Australian steakhouse? They've got all that along in here. Now this road that's coming in that looks like an intersection there is a road that goes across Grand Junction, and it's Business 70. Now we go up here, and this is a spot where the Highway 50 comes up over the rail line, and you turn left there at that intersection, and you've got a giant Sam's Club and all kinds of stuff like that. There's a mall up there. This is a fairly newly developed part of Grand Junction, and the main road is that wider road there, and it's going to come up here and parallel the railroad track. And you see, of course, the Colorado River directly below us. Over on the left, if you look at the Red Mountains, that is Colorado National Monument. It's an absolutely beautiful place. Been there several times, not in the past few years, but it hasn't changed. Nothing has moved. It's worth a trip to go in there and see it. If we were to fly over it, we would have to be at least 2,000 feet above ground level. So now we're actually running out of Grand Junction. It's coming along, and we're going to meet up with I-70 here very shortly. That's that big intersection that's coming up. There's a little bit of infrastructure along here, not a lot. So that intersection below us there is I-70. Now, Highway 6 and the railroad go straight, but the I-70 comes from the right, crosses the middle, and then goes out between some of those ponds out there, and then goes to eventually parallel the freeway. Now we're actually starting to get in the region of Mac. You'll note the stark difference, the stark and very dramatic line between the green of Grand Junction and the brown of the desert. It's not a subtle thing at all. Now we've moved ahead a little bit, and what you're seeing to the right of I-70 there is Fruita. And this is about the point where we're going to depart the highway and start traveling north, because we need to land from the west. So we've got to get around behind the airport so we can come in from the west. We have a left-hand pattern here, so we actually need to get slightly north of the runway, as you'll see in a minute. Okay, now we're heading north and losing altitude. We've got to get way down. I mean, the airport is 4,000 some odd feet. And so I'm just cranking back the power and letting it go down. Okay, now we're turning to head toward the west. There's this reservoir here that is a landmark that can be used to find it. You can actually see the runway from here, but to point it out would be nearly impossible. If you look at those clouds on the left and go straight down from the big cloud, you see a little vertical slash. That is the airport right there. We're going to go north of it. The airport's only 2,500 feet wide. They're long. That's not terribly long, really. So you don't want, you can't land long on this airport. You've got to come down pretty early. And so I'm totally concentrating on the pattern altitude here, getting it to the right altitude, which is about 5,600 feet or so. And we're going to stay at that altitude, and somewhere in here I'm going to pull the power back to 1,500 RPM. Right now it's about 2,200 RPM. And that will, and then pull flap, first set of flaps. And that will start to slow us down, and we'll start to come down about 500 feet per minute. Well, if the pattern altitude is 1,000 feet above the runway, and you're coming down at 500 feet a minute, that is 2 minutes from the time you start that till the time you're on the ground. So you want to do that right. A lot happens as you do this. We're starting to get a little crosswind as we come through here, so it'll be fine as we go around the corner. Now the edge of the runway just went off the screen here. As you can tell from the speed graph on the lower right, we're going to be slowing down rather dramatically here very quickly. So we go past the airport. We're north of it and west, and we're going to make a turn here, and this turn will set us up for the landing. We're going to turn 90 degrees, just 90 degrees. So we'll be heading south, and so we'll be perpendicular to that road. And you see that little hill right there, the airport's on top of that. Believe me, I am not looking at the hill. I am looking at the number 7 on the runway. And that number 7 is totally filling my consciousness, because that's where I want to be. And we're coming around. Note the speed gets just a little low, but again, there's wind. That's ground speed. Okay, now we're headed just about right into the airport. We let the wind blow us a little bit over. Okay, and I'm totally focused on that number 7. And my instructor is nervously sitting beside me. And we just come down here. There, you just heard the wheels touch down. And so now I'm actually using the brakes to slow us down, because we've only got 2,500 feet, and this thing will quite happily roll off the end of the runway. So there's just a few hangars there. Interesting airport. A group of people who teach youth to fly are here. Now I want you to get a load of this taxiway here. This thing is just wide enough for the 3 wheels in the airplane. Now the camera is way out on the left wing, so I'm not actually going off the runway there. So we'll stop here to make our radio calls, and that's it. Of course, we had to reverse the trip and go back to Delta. I just included a little extra there to show going over Grand Junction. You could see the confluence of the junction of the Colorado River and the Gunnison River. It's quite interesting because although the rivers look to be about equally wide, it's clear that there's a lot more flow in the Colorado River than in the Gunnison. So there you have it. I want to point out, this is very important, I am a student pilot. I am documenting the instruction that I am receiving, and so there very likely will be errors in here. Please don't use this as training or something to emulate on your own. I'm a student pilot, not an instructor pilot. And until we next meet, 73.